Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about domain-driven design for microservices, or DDD4M as the cool kids call it.
That's right.
I'm really excited to dig into this with you.
I am too.
You know, it seems like everyone's talking about DDD4M these days,
Yeah.
but it's not always clear what it actually means in practice or, if it really lives up to all the hype.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of hype out there.
So we're going to try to cut through all of that today and get to the heart of what DDD4M is all about.
Yeah, and luckily you found some really good research to help us with this.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about this research.
Sure. So, this isn't just some, pie in the sky theoretical stuff.
Right.
We're working with a recent academic research paper that was published in IE Transactions on Software Engineering. So,
Nice. Very credible source.
yes, very credible. And more importantly, it's grounded in real-world experience.
Okay, so what kind of real-world experience are we talking about here?
So this paper is based on two really solid sources of information. First, it includes this comprehensive review of 34 different scientific studies on DDD4M. So,
Wow, so they really did their homework.
yeah, they did a really good job of summarizing the existing research. And then on top of that,
Okay.
they actually surveyed 63 practitioners who are actually using DDD4M out there in the wild.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, so we get that real-world perspective.
That reality check.
Exactly.
Okay, before we jump into all the nitty-gritty details, I think it's important to start with the basics.
Yeah,
What exactly is DDD4M?
right.
We know it involves domain-driven design, DDD,
Uh-huh.
and we know it involves microservice architecture, MSA.
Yes.
But how do those two pieces actually fit together?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So let's break it down.
Yeah.
Let's start with domain-driven design.
Right.
DDD is all about really understanding the problem you're trying to solve, the domain, as they call it in DDD,
Yeah.
and then using that understanding to guide the way you design and build your software.
So it's about making sure that the software actually reflects the real-world problem it's supposed to address.
Yes, exactly. You want that really tight coupling between the problem domain and the software itself.
Okay, I'm following so far.
Good.
Now let's add in microservice architecture, MSA.
Okay.
So that's where you're taking your application and breaking it down into these smaller, independent services.
Yeah,
Kind of like mini applications that work together.
right.
Now, how does DDD help with that?
That's where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
Because one of the biggest challenges with MSA is figuring out how to break down your application into those smaller services.
Right. Where do you draw those lines?
Exactly. Where do you draw those boundaries? And DDD4M can really help with that.
Okay.
It helps you define those boundaries in a way that makes sense from a business perspective so that each service aligns nicely with a particular business capability.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, so instead of just kind of randomly chopping up your application, you're thinking carefully about those natural dividing lines based on the problem domain.
So it's like instead of randomly chopping up a pizza, you're actually cutting it along those natural slices.
Exactly.
All right, so we've got DDD and we've got MSA and we're kind of smashing them together.
Yeah.
When did this DDD4M craze actually take off?
So the research pinpoints this pretty specific moment.
Okay.
Interest in DDD4M really skyrocketed around 2015, 2016.
Oh, wow, that recently.
Yeah, pretty recent, and it all kind of seems to stem from this keynote speech that Eric Evans, who is considered the pioneer of DDD, gave at a major conference.
The power of a great conference talk.
Right, and it seems like that's when the light bulb really went off for a lot of people in terms of the connection between DDD and MSA.
So this idea had been kind of floating around, but it really took that one talk to crystallize it for folks.
It seems like it, and the research also shows that publications on DDD4M have tripled in recent years.
Wow, so it's not just a flash in the pan.
No, definitely not. It's gaining momentum both in academia and in industry.
All right, so people are clearly interested in it, but where is DDD4M actually being used in the real world?
That's a great question.
Is it applicable to any software project, or are there certain areas where it really shines?
Well, that's where those real-world insights from the survey come in.
Yeah.
It turns out that DDD4M is particularly popular for projects that have very complex business logic.
Okay.
For example, the research found that a huge 38% of the projects they looked at were in the professional services space, and another 24% were in e-commerce.
So industries where the behind-the-scenes rules and processes are really complicated.
Exactly. Think about things like complex financial modeling or insurance calculations or those elaborate order fulfillment systems that we all rely on.
Right, all those intricate details that we don't even think about.
Right, exactly. So DDD4M provides a framework for taming all of that complexity.
Okay.
So if your project involves a lot of complicated business rules, it could be a sign that DDD4M is worth investigating.
That's a good takeaway.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused about something. The research mentioned that DDD4M itself isn't about tackling technical complexity.
That's
So if my project has complex business rules,
Yeah.
and it also has some pretty gnarly technical challenges,
Yeah.
does that mean that DDD4M isn't a good fit?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So here's the thing.
All right.
DDD4M is all about organizing your code around the business domain,
Okay.
but it's often used in projects that also have that technical complexity.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that microservice architecture, which DDD4M helps to define, is also really well suited for handling technical complexity.
So it's like you've got two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
DDD4M is taking care of the business logic side.
Yeah.
And then you've got other approaches that can handle the technical complexity.
That's a great way to think about it.
They can work together nicely.
They complement each other.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Good.
So people are clearly interested in DDD4M. We've seen that.
Yeah.
But what's actually motivating them to adopt it?
Right.
Are they doing it just because it's the trendy new thing, or are there some deeper reasons?
Well, the survey results reveal some interesting motivations. The top two reasons given by practitioners were not very surprising.
Okay.
First, tackling that domain complexity, which a huge 87% of respondents confirmed as a key motivation.
Yeah, makes sense.
And second, figuring out those microservice boundaries effectively, which 71% of practitioners said was a big driver for them.
All right, so far so good. No big surprises there.
No big surprises there, but are you ready for the real kicker?
Hit me with it. I love these aha moments.
A full 54% of practitioners admitted they jumped on the DDD4M bandwagon simply because it was trendy.
Ha ha. So the fear of missing out, FOMO, is real, even in the software world.
It's a real phenomenon.
I can totally relate to that pressure to keep up with all the latest and greatest stuff.
Yeah, you don't want to feel left behind.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not all about trends.
Definitely not.
Practitioners also reported some less obvious but really valuable benefits of using DDD4M.
That's right.
For example, they found that it actually helps them understand the business better.
Yeah.
So by creating this shared language between the technical folks and the business folks, DDD4M can help bridge that communication gap that we all know is so common in software development.
Yes, it breaks down those silos.
Right, exactly. And if everybody's speaking the same language, it's going to
Mhm.
make collaboration a lot easier.
Absolutely. And it also leads to more clarity in the design and implementation of the system.
So fewer misunderstandings, fewer mistakes.
Exactly. Any other perks?
Yeah. Were there any other unexpected benefits that folks mentioned?
Yes, practitioners also reported that DDD4M led to higher quality systems overall.
Really?
Yeah, the systems they built using this approach tended to be more maintainable and more scalable over time.
So less technical debt, fewer headaches down the road.
Exactly. And here's another interesting thing.
Okay.
Teams reported that working with DDD4M boosted their object-oriented design skills.
Oh, wow. So it's like a free skill upgrade.
It's like professional development baked right in.
I like that.
Yeah.
So it's more than just a buzzword.
It is.
It's actually helping teams build better software.
Yeah, it gives you a framework, a set of tools and techniques that can really make a difference.
So it helps you wrangle that complex logic, define those service boundaries effectively, and you level up your skills along the way.
Exactly.
Not bad for something that kind of started with a conference talk.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
All right, so we've talked about the what and the why,
Yeah.
but let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the people involved.
Okay.
At its core, DDD is all about collaboration.
Yes.
Collaboration between those technical experts like developers
Right.
and the domain experts, the people who really have that deep knowledge of the business.
Yeah, the subject matter experts.
So the people who actually use the software day in and day out.
Exactly, the ones who can really tell you what the system needs to do.
Makes sense. So how does this collaboration actually play out in a DDD4M project?
Right.
Are we talking about like constant meetings, brainstorming sessions?
Well, it can vary depending on the team and the project.
Okay.
But while Eric Evans, who kind of invented DDD, is a big advocate for lots of face-to-face discussion.
Okay.
The research found that in practice, documentation and informal meetings are still the most common communication methods.
Interesting.
Yeah, but here's a really curious twist. The research found that domain expert involvement was actually lowest in teams with mid-level DDD4M experience.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so teams that had been using DDD4M for like 2-3 years actually had the least amount of domain expert involvement.
Wow, that's surprising.
It is a little bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, you think that the more experience you have, the more you'd want to involve those experts.
You would think so.
But it seems like maybe after a couple of years, those teams felt like they had a good enough grasp of the domain, and they didn't need as much input.
That's a possibility, or maybe they just got a little bit too comfortable and started making assumptions.
Yeah, the "we got this" syndrome.
Exactly, and that can be dangerous.
It can lead to those costly mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good reminder to always keep those lines of communication open with your domain expert.
Absolutely never underestimate their value.
Right? They're a goldmine of information.
Okay, so I know that DDD has these things called strategic and tactical patterns.
Yes.
Can you give us a quick breakdown of what those are and how they work in a DDD4M project?
Sure. So think of strategic patterns as your high-level map.
Okay.
They guide the big picture breakdown of your domain into those bounded contexts.
Okay, so it's the what.
Yes, the what.
What are the big pieces?
Exactly. And then tactical patterns are more like the detailed blueprints for designing what goes on inside each of those microservices.
Okay, so that's the how.
Exactly, the how. So you've got the big picture, and then you've got the nitty-gritty details.
Got it.
And here's a key finding from the research. 81% of practitioners don't use tactical patterns for every single microservice.
Oh, really? Why not?
Well, it actually ties into a core concept in DDD called the core domain.
Okay.
The idea is that some parts of your system are more complex and more critical than others.
Okay.
And those are the parts where you really want to bring in those powerful tactical patterns.
So it's about being strategic with your strategy.
Exactly. You focus those detailed design efforts where they'll have the biggest impact.
So it's like you don't need to use a sledgehammer to crack every nut.
Exactly. Use the right tool for the job.
Now, how do developers actually feel about using these patterns?
Right.
Do they feel confident using them, or is there kind of a steep learning curve?
Well, the good news is that over 60% of practitioners reported feeling confident using tactical patterns.
Okay, so that's not too bad.
Yeah, it suggests that they're not too difficult to grasp once you get the hang of them.
Okay.
But there's a bit of a catch when it comes to those strategic patterns.
Oh, I don't like the sound of that.
Less than 50% of practitioners said they were satisfied with how they were applying strategic patterns.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the research points out that it's really important to have a well-defined process to guide the use of both types of patterns.
So it's not just about knowing the patterns themselves.
Right.
It's also about knowing how to effectively apply them in a real-world project.
Exactly, and that's where things can get a little bit tricky, especially for teams that are new to DDD4M.
Okay, so now I'm really curious about the tools of the trade. What kind of languages and tools do people actually use when they're implementing DDD4M?
This is where things get a little bit surprising.
Okay.
Remember, at the heart of DDD4M is domain modeling.
Yeah.
That's where you're creating those representations of the key concepts and relationships in your software.
Right, those models.
Exactly. And while there are some specialized modeling languages that have been designed specifically for DDD4M,
Right.
the vast majority of practitioners are still using good old UML.
Really?
A full 76% of respondents said they rely on UML for their domain modeling.
So there's a bit of a gap between what the researchers are promoting and what's actually happening out there in the trenches.
It seems that way. A lot of the research is pushing these new fancy DDD4M languages, but they haven't really caught on with practitioners.
Interesting. So I guess it makes you wonder if everybody else is sticking with the familiar.
Yeah.
Does that make you more or less likely to try out those new tools?
That's a good question to ask yourself.
Yeah.
What's your risk tolerance? Are you an early adopter, or do you like to wait until things are a little bit more mature?
Yeah, it's always a trade-off.
It is.
And speaking of tried and true when it comes to the actual programming languages used for DDD4M, Java is still king.
Yeah, Java is still the dominant language for enterprise software development.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do teams make sure that the code they actually write matches the domain model that they've so carefully designed?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah, because you don't want those two things to get out of sync.
Exactly, and it's something that DDD4M practitioners are really working hard to address.
Okay.
The top 3 ways they're tackling this challenge are through code review, which 49% of respondents said they rely on,
Okay.
predefined coding standards used by 20%, and testing, which 10% mentioned.
So it seems like there's a lot of emphasis on communication and making sure everybody's on the same page and that the code really reflects the design.
Absolutely. You want that consistency between the model and the implementation.
Okay, so we've touched on some of the challenges that teams face when they're implementing DDD4M.
Yeah.
But are there any solutions or workarounds that are being proposed?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of research and experimentation happening in this space.
Okay.
And this is an area where you, as a practitioner, can also contribute your own experiences and insights.
I love that.
Yeah, we can all learn from each other.
So let's start with that big one, the lack of a unified, widely accepted process for DDD4M.
Right. That's a major pain point.
It is.
Both researchers and 62% of the practitioners in the survey confirmed this.
And it's especially challenging for those less experienced teams.
Absolutely. They don't have that intuition yet to fall back on.
Right. So what are people proposing as a solution to that?
Well, some studies are proposing more detailed process descriptions, basically outlining step by step what's involved in a DDD4M project from the very beginning to the very end.
So like a DDD4M roadmap or playbook.
Exactly, trying to bring more structure and clarity to the whole process.
That sounds helpful.
Yeah, it could be, but even with those roadmaps in place,
Yeah.
there's still this issue of ambiguity when it comes to identifying those bounded contexts.
Right. Like where do you actually draw those lines?
Exactly. And it's interesting because even experienced teams struggle with this. Only 48% of them felt really confident in their ability to nail down those boundaries.
Wow. So it's not an easy problem to solve.
It's not. It often comes down to a judgment call where you're balancing a lot of different factors like
Mm.
requirements, team structure, and the quality attributes you want in your system.
I could see how that would lead to a lot of head scratching and maybe even some heated debates.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And just to add another layer of complexity, there's also that ongoing challenge of bridging the gap between the domain model and the code.
Right. You want those two things to be in sync.
Exactly. And the research found that 39% of practitioners said this is a major challenge.
It's not easy.
It's not.
It really comes down to having clear communication between the people who are designing the model and the people who are writing the code.
And rigorous code review, I imagine.
Yes, code review is essential to make sure that the code is actually reflecting the design.
So it's a complex puzzle with lots of moving pieces.
It is.
But that's kind of what makes software development so interesting.
It's what keeps us coming back for more.
Absolutely.
It's never boring.
Never boring.
And I think the key is to embrace those challenges, to see them as opportunities to learn and grow.
Well said.
And remember, this is a journey that we're all on together.
I love that.
We can learn from each other's experiences and help each other along the way.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our DDD4M deep dive.
We have.
From the fundamentals of the approach to some of the real-world challenges that teams are facing.
Yeah, we've laid a good foundation.
What are some of the key takeaways that you'd like to leave our listener with before we move on to part 2?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that DDD4M is a really promising approach, but it's not a silver bullet.
It's not a plug-and-play solution.
Definitely not. You can't just sprinkle some DDD4M on your project and magically make all your problems disappear.
Right. It takes some work.
It does take work, and it takes careful consideration.
Okay.
You need to really think about your domain, your people, your processes, your tools.
So be intentional, be thoughtful. Don't just jump on the bandwagon because it's the cool new thing.
Exactly. Understand what DDD4M is all about, and then decide if it's the right fit for you.
Words of wisdom. I love it.
And I think another key takeaway is that this is an ongoing conversation.
Okay.
There's still a lot we don't know about DDD4M.
Right. It's still relatively young.
It's a young and evolving field.
There's a lot more research and experimentation to be done.
Exactly, and we can all be part of that.
I love that.
So stay curious,
Stay curious.
keep experimenting, and never stop learning.
Well said. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you.
We'll be back soon with part 2, where we'll continue our exploration of DDD4M and delve into even more fascinating topics.
Looking forward to it.
Until then, happy coding, everybody.
Happy coding. Welcome back to our deep dive into DDD4M.
DDD4M, it's a mouthful, but it's been a fascinating journey so far.
We've unpacked so much already about what it is, why it's gaining traction, all the challenges, the opportunities.
Right. And remember, we're doing all of this to help you navigate this approach, whether you're knee-deep in a project or just expanding your knowledge.
Exactly. And in this part of our deep dive, we're going to take an even closer look at some of those challenges and the potential solutions that researchers and practitioners are exploring.
Perfect, because let's face it, no approach is perfect.
True.
Even the most promising ones have their own quirks and hurdles to overcome.
True. And one of the biggest hurdles, as we discussed earlier, is this lack of a standardized, widely accepted process for applying DDD4M.
Right, that DDD4M cookbook problem.
Exactly.
So what are some ways that people are trying to tackle this?
Well, some researchers are advocating for more explicit process descriptions,
Okay.
essentially outlining the steps involved in a DDD4M project, from the initial domain analysis all the way to code implementation.
So like a roadmap to guide you through the process.
Exactly. And these descriptions often include details about the artifacts that you'll create along the way, like domain models, context maps, code specifications.
That makes a lot of sense. Having a clear set of steps and deliverables can definitely bring more structure to a project.
Absolutely. But even with a well-defined process, there's still the question of how to actually implement it.
Right.
And that's where the role of tools and languages comes into play.
Right, because you can have the best roadmap in the world,
Right.
but if you don't have the right tools to navigate it, you're still going to get lost.
Precisely. And that's why there's a lot of research focused on developing specialized modeling languages for DDD4M. The idea is to create languages that are more expressive and tailored to the specific concepts and patterns of DDD.
So instead of relying on general-purpose modeling languages like UML, you'd have languages specifically designed for representing bounded contexts, aggregates, domain events, all those other DDD goodies.
Exactly. And these languages can be incredibly powerful because they allow you to create more precise and unambiguous models, which in turn can make it easier to generate code, document your system, and ensure consistency across your project.
Okay, I see the benefits of using these specialized languages,
Mhm.
but as we saw earlier, there's a bit of a disconnect between what's happening in the research world and what practitioners are actually using. What do you think that is?
Well, there are a few possible reasons.
Okay.
First, as we mentioned, there's the comfort factor.
Uh-huh.
Many developers are already familiar with UML, so there's a natural resistance to learning a new language, especially if it's not widely adopted yet.
Plus, those specialized languages might not be as well supported by existing tools and frameworks. That can make them a lot harder to integrate into a real-world project.
You're absolutely right. That's another major barrier to adoption.
So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation.
Exactly. The languages need better tool support to gain wider adoption,
Right.
but the tools might not get developed until there's enough demand for the languages.
Classic tech world dilemma.
Right, but let's not forget about the human side of this.
Right.
Even with the best processes and tools, DDD4M is still all about collaboration and communication, right?
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting because, as we saw earlier, the level of domain expert involvement can fluctuate quite a bit based on the team's level of experience.
Right.
Right. That dip in involvement we saw with those mid-level teams was fascinating.
Yeah.
Any more thoughts on what might be going on there?
Well, it's speculation, of course.
Sure.
But one possibility is that as teams gain more experience with DDD4M, they start to feel more confident in their ability to understand and model the domain. And that confidence, while valuable, can sometimes lead to overconfidence.
The we got this syndrome.
Exactly. And that can lead to teams making assumptions or cutting corners, which ultimately can impact the quality of the software.
So the lesson here is to never underestimate the value of ongoing collaboration with domain experts,
Yes,
no matter how experienced your team becomes.
exactly. Those experts have a wealth of knowledge and insights that can help you avoid costly mistakes and build a system that truly meets the needs of the users.
Well said. Now, I want to switch gears for a moment and talk about another challenge that came up in the research, the gap between that domain model and the actual code implementation.
Ah, yes, the age-old struggle of translating design into reality.
Right. So how are teams trying to bridge that gap? Are there any magic bullets?
Unfortunately, no magic bullets in software development.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
But there are definitely approaches that can help. One common strategy is to use code generation techniques.
So automatically generating code from the domain model.
Precisely. There are tools out there that can take a well-defined domain model and generate a good portion of the code, especially for things like data structures, basic business logic, and even API endpoints.
That sounds incredibly efficient, but isn't there a risk of losing some flexibility or control over the code if you're relying on automation?
There's always a trade-off. It's important to choose the right tool for the job. Some code generation tools are very rigid and don't allow for much customization, while others are more flexible and allow you to tweak the generated code.
So it's about finding the right balance between automation and control.
Exactly. And it's also about understanding the limitations of code generation. It's not a replacement for solid design and development practices.
Right.
It's simply a tool to help you work more efficiently.
Makes sense. Now, what about testing? Does that play a role in bridging the gap between the model and the code?
Absolutely. Testing is essential in any software development project, but it's especially crucial in DDD4M because of the emphasis on aligning the code with that domain model.
So you want to have tests that specifically check that the code behaves exactly as the model dictates.
Exactly. And there are various types of tests that can help with this.
Right.
You'd have unit tests to check the individual components of your code integration tests to make sure the different parts of your system are playing nicely together, and acceptance tests to validate that the system as a whole is meeting those business requirements.
So it's a multi-layered approach to testing,
Yes.
all with the goal of ensuring that the code faithfully reflects the domain model.
Precisely. And this focus on testing can actually have some interesting side effects.
Oh, like what?
Well, some practitioners have found that writing tests before writing the code can actually help them better understand the domain model itself.
Interesting. So thinking about how to test the code forces you to really think through the domain.
Exactly. It's a form of design by contract where you're essentially defining the behavior of the code before you even write it. And that process can uncover gaps or ambiguities in the model that you might not have noticed otherwise.
Hmm. That's a fascinating insight. It's like testing isn't just about verifying the code.
Right.
It's also a tool for refining the design.
Precisely. And that's why it's such a vital part of the DDD4M process.
This is all starting to paint a really detailed picture of the DDD4M landscape.
It is.
We've seen the promise, the challenges, the potential solutions.
Yeah.
What are some final thoughts you'd like to leave our listener with as we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
I think it's important to remember that DDD4M is still a relatively young approach.
Okay.
There's a lot of ongoing research and experimentation, and the best practices are still evolving.
So it's not a set it and forget it type of thing,
Definitely not. It's a journey of continuous learning and improvement.
and a journey that we'll continue to explore in part 3 of our deep dive.
That's right.
Stay tuned for even more insights and perspectives on this fascinating and ever-evolving approach to software development. Welcome back to our DDD4M deep dive. This is the final part, and I'm excited to wrap this all up and see where we end up.
It's been quite a journey. We've covered so much ground, from the fundamentals of DDD4M to those real-world challenges and those cutting-edge research areas. Now it's all about synthesizing what we've learned. Maybe we can even spark some inspiration for our listener.
I like that. Let's do it. So let's go back to that really interesting question we left hanging in part 2. The research highlighted a growing trend of adding those extra representations to traditional DDD models to really capture all those technical details that maybe weren't addressed as much in the past.
Right, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Traditional DDD was really focused on the business domain, but with microservices becoming so prevalent, we need to pay more attention to those technical aspects.
So it's like DDD4M is pushing the boundaries of what we traditionally thought of as DDD. It's
Yeah.
making us think more holistically about how we represent both the business side and the technical side of the systems we're building.
Exactly. And that leads us to an important question. What are the potential risks and rewards of adding those extra layers of detail to our models?
Well, on the one hand, having those more detailed models seems like it could be really helpful. They could be more comprehensive, easier to understand, and might make it easier to translate those designs into actual working code.
Right. It could really help us bridge that gap between the design and the implementation that we've been talking about.
But, and there's always a but, right? We have to be careful not to go overboard. If we try to capture every single detail in one giant model, it could become so complex that it's just too difficult to manage and understand.
That's the balancing act, isn't it? How do we create models that are detailed and comprehensive without being overwhelmingly complex?
Yeah, finding that sweet spot. So, how are people tackling this in the real world? Are there any examples of teams successfully adding those extra layers of detail to their models without everything exploding?
Well, one approach that I've seen work well is the use of something called deployment models. It's essentially a separate model that focuses specifically on how those microservices in a system are going to be deployed and how they'll interact with each other.
So it's like a technical roadmap for how the system's infrastructure is going to work.
Exactly. And the great thing about this is that you can link that deployment model back to the main domain model. That way you can clearly see the connections between the business concepts and those technical components.
It's like building a bridge between two worlds.
Exactly. And this bridge can be incredibly valuable for communication and collaboration. Developers can see how their code fits into the bigger picture. Operations teams can understand the business logic behind the services they're deploying. It brings everyone together.
It sounds like a win-win. Okay, now I want to bring this back to those domain experts we've been talking about, those folks with the deep business knowledge. They're essential to DDV, but how do they fit into this world of supplementary models, which can often be pretty technical?
That's a really important question. Ideally, those supplementary models, even though they're more technical, should still be accessible to domain experts.
So using clear language and avoiding too much technical jargon.
Exactly. And it might also involve using visual representations like diagrams or even interactive simulations. Anything that can help communicate those technical concepts in a more intuitive and easy to grasp way.
It's about finding that right balance between being technically accurate and making sure those models are understandable to a broader audience.
Absolutely. And of course, that balance is going to vary depending on the specific domain you're working in and the technical expertise of those domain experts you're working with.
Yeah, it always comes back to context, doesn't it? There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. And I think that's a great point to wrap up on. DDD4M isn't about rigid rules or cookie cutter solutions. It's a mindset, a way of thinking about software design that's constantly evolving and adapting.
It's about embracing that complexity, understanding the domain deeply, and never being afraid to experiment and refine your approach as you learn more.
Well said.
And most importantly, it's about collaboration. Collaboration within your development teams and, of course, with those all-important domain experts.
Because at the end of the day, DDD4M is all about building software that solves real problems and delivers real value to the people who use it.
This has been a fantastic deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the world of DDD4M. I hope our listeners found it informative and thought-provoking.
I hope so too. And remember, your DDD4M journey doesn't end here. There's a wealth of resources out there to keep you learning and exploring. You can find links to the research we discussed in the episode notes.
Keep that curiosity burning, keep experimenting, keep learning, and until next time, happy coding, everyone.